This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm speaking to Dr Anne Karpf. Anne is Professor of Life Writing and Culture at London Metropolitan University and is a writer, sociologist and award-winning journalist. In 2021, she released the book How Women Can Save the Planet, where she looks at how there is gender inequality across the board, from how we experience the climate crisis to our ability to affect change. Anne begins by telling us about her background and her work.
I wear quite a lot of hats, really, and do a lot of juggling because with one hat on, I've got an academic hat where I'm Professor of Life Writing and Culture at London Metropolitan University, and that's half time. But for many decades, I've also been a journalist and a writer. I mean, largely writing for The Guardian over the last few decades, but I've really written for almost every national newspaper. And I've written 5 books of non-fiction. And they're all about completely different subjects in a way. Only to me, they don't seem completely different subjects. They all connect up, if you like. So, yeah, that's me.
Excellent. So I thought I might talk mainly today about your book, How Women Can Save the Planet. I mean, it was a brilliant book. I loved it. And there were lots of questions that I have for you after reading it. So I wondered if we could maybe delve into and explore a bit more in detail some of what you wrote about. I suppose a fundamental question is, why do we need to distinguish between men and women when it comes to environmentalism?
Well, in fact, it's a very important question because some people, when you start talking about this, they say, oh, for goodness sake, we're facing a climate catastrophe. This is no time for special pleading. We've got to all pull together. We're all in it together. This is a distraction. We can deal with that later. And honestly, there is a wealth of evidence to show that that is absolutely not the case. That the causes of the climate crisis are gendered, the impact is gendered, and the way we're going about tackling it is also gendered. And I should really stress here that I'm talking about gender and not sex. So this isn't kind of all women good or men bad narrative at all. It's about the social roles and conventions and identities that we grow up with, and how they have played in to the climate crisis, along with other things like social class, race, disability, all those intersectional aspects cut across each other. And the reason we need to think about it is because the climate crisis has had and continues to have increasingly a profound impact on women, quite apart from the impact it has on everyone, and in particular, women of colour in the global south. And these are the very women who have done least to cause the climate crisis, and yet they are being so impacted by it. And also, these are the women who, if you like, are being shut out of the solutions to the problem. So on these 3 axes, if you like, there's a gender story there. And it's a story that is not widely known, even though there have been sort of probably 20 years of really robust, rigorous research on the subject. I mean, when I started to read it, I was astonished that this wasn't better known. And in a sense, what I tried to do in my book is to bring all that research together, to sort of assemble it, but in a way that I hope is readable. And then in between all of that, I've done interviews with 20 climate activists around the world, but I've used 8 of them here quite extensively, which I've edited with the people I interviewed in between each chapter to really bring it to life and make people understand how it's impacting on individual women and what they're doing about it.
So again, looking at it from a gender point of view, I guess some people would say, well, some men care about the environment and some don't. And the same is true for some women. Some do, some don't.
Exactly right. And so what I absolutely reject is that argument that somehow women have kind of some sort of innate caring gene. like they have a mothering gene or whatever, all of which I absolutely reject. And of course, individual men, I live with one. I've lived with one for many decades who treads very lightly on the planet and cares for it enormously. So this isn't about individual men and women. This is about gender in more general ways. So, for example, because of women's roles, particularly those in the global south, women are responsible, for example, for gathering water and firewood. When you have a climate crisis, those tasks become a lot more onerous. In other words, you have to travel further to get wood because of drought and because so much wood has been used up and not been replenished. You have to travel further again to get water because of drought. And so these are girls who are doing this. I give the example of Aisha in Ethiopia, who's 13 and travels by camel each day 8 hours to gather water. And of course, she had to drop out of school. So these women, the impact of the climate crisis on their lives are enormous. We know what causes the climate crisis. We've known for a very long time that, for example, cars are a really bad thing, petrol cars. And those cars are mainly owned and driven by men. Now, that isn't always a matter of choice. If you live somewhere that isn't served by good public transport, and most of us do now, unless you live in fairly centrally in London, which I do. But, if you're living in the country, to get to work, you may have to use a car. There may be no alternative if you can afford to use one. So cars, for example, have a strong gender dimension. Or let's say meat. There's a very strong connection between meat eating and ideas around masculinity. And in fact, some activists have talked about the climate crisis as a crisis of masculinity, because some of the behaviours that cause the climate crisis are intrinsic to the very traditional idea of masculinity. And the impact, let me give you another example. There's a lot of evidence now that there's been an increase in what's been called climate violence. So, and this isn't confined to the global south, rich countries like Australia and New Zealand, where there have been bushfires or floods, men have traditionally seen their role as defending their property and their family. And when a disaster like that happens, they can no longer do that. And the frustration and anger they feel often leads them to lash out and to be violent towards those closest to them, who are women. And I won't bore you with lots of statistics, but we know in general that disasters, climate-induced disasters like cyclones, floods, droughts, impact upon women very severely, that women are 14 times more likely to die in extreme weather events that are brought about by the climate crisis. And this is nothing to do with, good women, bad men, or anything like that. It's to do with social roles. The fact that women, particularly in the global south, have not been encouraged to learn how to swim, or they're wearing clothing that would impede them running away, or they look after the children mainly and the elders, and they stay behind to look after them. Or if they're trying to flee, they try and take the cooking materials as well. So all these factors, when you put them together, show a very clear gender pattern in the causes of the climate crisis and the impact of it. And again, I will stress that this isn't to say that men haven't, there are many men who have been very prominent in drawing attention and warning about what's been happening with the climate, and have been prominent in trying to change it.
There may be a tendency to frame women as climate saviours. And obviously there's a responsibility that goes with that. But if they are so drastically impacted, is there a problem with women then taking on the responsibility for solving the problems?
Totally. And in fact, in spite of the title of my book, which is the one thing that I do slightly regret, because it does sort of lead into the women as saviour narrative, which is absolutely one that I reject. The idea that you're doing the shopping, the cooking, the cleaning and the childcare. Oh, yes, and in your spare time, why don't you save the planet? is not one that I admire at all. On the contrary, I think it's been called the feminization of responsibility. And that idea, I gave one talk and a woman came up to me afterwards, a woman of colour, and she said to me, I almost didn't come to this talk because I just thought you'd be saying recycle, recycle, recycle. And, there's that whole thing about, if you shop better, you can change things. Well, really, I tell you, I spent many months trying to find a dress that wasn't made out of polyester. And when I think what I could have done with those hours of manic Googling, it makes me quite sad. I think that, I call it in my book, blame the dame, because, if you say that women can be the saviours by the same token, you're starting to blame women. And we have seen a whole kind of discourse of blame around the climate crisis, particularly around women having children in the global south. The idea that there's this fertility, particularly of Muslim women, is somehow the population explosion. And you have that from, people like Saint David Attenborough or Prince William, this thing about, well, David Attenborough actually said, we have destroyed the planet. And who is this we? No, not everyone is equally responsible. And this idea that women's fertility is responsible, it's just a nonsense, because if you look at those countries in sub-Saharan Africa where women have the greatest number of children, countries like Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, those countries don't figure in the top 75 greenhouse gas emitting nations. They could have 20 children and it wouldn't have the impact that my 2 children have had, even though one of them, hardly buys anything and is as green as can come. But, those of us in the global north, the consumption of the global north is what has caused this problem. And the solutions aren't going to be to take your cartons and your plastic bags to recycling, however important that is. So I think this idea that somehow women, we can spend our way to a greener planet is a really dangerous idea.
You mentioned the kind of collective we, and I wondered actually how women factor among the controllers of the means of kind of polluting productions. Are women represented equally amongst that group?
Do you mean in women's consumption?
Actually, I meant more the people who are in control of these production processes that are causing pollution.
I mean, women are, if you look at the fossil fuel companies, they are pretty much dominated by white older men. Now, that isn't to say, I gave one talk somewhere and someone put up their hand and they asked, do you think if women were running those fossil fuel companies rather than men, that would change anything or that would be okay? And I went, obviously, no. What's wrong is the extraction of fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels. That's what's wrong. And if you change the personnel at the top and change the gender, that's not going to do anything. What we do know, though, from some quite good research and quite a number of studies now, is that if more women are involved in the political system, and women have higher political status, those countries where that is so, those countries are more likely to ratify strong environmental protection. And why? Again, not because of some innate caring gene, but largely because of their social roles, our social roles. Women are having to pick up the pieces after climate disaster. You have to migrate. You're in an emergency shelter, you have to re-establish a family home, you have to cook, you have to try and wash. So women consistently come up as more risk averse in their actions and the impact on the climate. So women are more sensitized to that, in part because we have to deal with the aftermath. And that argues for integrating women much more in policy making, whereas the reality, honestly, I was so shocked when I looked at these figures, because the UN has dozens of committees on climate, and in almost every one, women are only present. They're about a third or a fifth of the members. And actually, it's been getting worse and not better. So, women's lived experience is not represented at the top table where decisions are making. So, although when we had all those street protests, and the Greta Thunbergs, the figureheads, and then you see all the shots and they're young, teenage girls a lot of the time. In reality, at the top table, it's mainly men.
Yeah, that is shocking and unbelievable, actually, in this day and age. But talking of things that are shocking, just when I thought I was out of being surprised by the stupidity of people, I went and read about rolling coal in your book. And I just thought it was worth a mention because I couldn't honestly comprehend it. And I just wondered if you could explain what that is.
Yeah, this is where, macho men, particularly in the US, are driving like pickup trucks or cars, and they don't want petrol-based, gas-based, as they would say. They don't want to minimize the emissions. On the contrary, they want their cars to emit as much as possible in a kind of act of defiance. And it's very much a kind of Trump thing. And it goes with this kind of toxic masculinity of, look how many steaks I can eat. And I'm not going to be curbed, by all these, quote, woke people. And actually, although it's less extreme, you see it now in the people who are objecting to low traffic neighborhoods. The majority of those protesters are white car owning men. I mean, nothing against older white men. I live with one and he's wonderful, but there's definitely a gender dimension on there. So it's a backlash to concerns about the climate.
Yeah, it was so shocking. I couldn't resist talking about it. So thinking in positive terms, there must be women making a real difference. And I wondered if you could talk about which women really are making strides.
This is what's so exciting. I have a natural inclination to pessimism. I'm not known in my family for optimism, but I tell you, I really changed through the writing of this book. I became really excited by what was going on. First of all, there are some female figureheads, important figures like Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan woman who started the Green Belt movement of planting trees and getting women to plant trees in Kenya. She was the first African Nobel Prize winner. Or women like Vandana Shiva, who's a long-standing Indian activist who, you've heard about, I'm sure, Indian farmers, male farmers committing suicide in really very disturbing numbers. And this is partly as a result of transnational corporations patenting seeds, so that if they want to buy seeds, they're basically, every time they buy and plant a seed, they're filling the coffers of these very wealthy organizations, and they're going bankrupt and committing suicide. And Vandana Shiva set up a network of community seed banks that you can use free to get seeds. And so there are individual women like that. Then there are women like Indigenous women who are fighting against what were very bravely under Bolsonaro, fighting against the illegal mining and felling of forests in the Amazon. But there are also some really interesting things happening close to home, because I think one of the problems in discussing this is once you start to realize that the scale of the devastation of the natural world, and then you start to hear some of the proposed solutions, that are either totally ineffective, like carbon offsetting. One of the interviewees from my book said, carbon offsetting is like if I wanted to lose weight and get fit, I paid someone on the other side of the world to go to the gym for me. And I thought that was a wonderful analogy. Or you get kind of geoengineering. Again, mostly men, older white men, who are suggesting things like 16 flying robots sent to deflect the rays of the sun, or submarines to refreeze the poles. So you get these kind of really dangerous ideas to hacking the climate, which could have really damaging side effects. What I think of them as a kind of gigantism, and they're a response to the idea that this is such a huge problem that either we have to go at that level, or we just have to concentrate on recycling, and I mustn't buy polyester, or we end up in despair. And I think a couple of things that really excite me. One of them is an initiative through a group called the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. And what they've said is, look, in every area, they're community wealth building organisations. There's the school, there's the hospital, there's the university, there's the gym. And all these places are having to buy things. They have canteens. And what they're doing at the moment is most of them are buying in, particularly hospitals, buying in rubbish food, which, anyone who's been in hospital and eaten hospital food knows it makes you sicker and not healthier. And often this food has come from far away. So there are a lot of transport, miles. And also it is produced, or the company in charge of it is a multinational company who's probably got its headquarters in the Cayman Islands, so they're not even paying any tax. And what they found with various local initiatives is that these organizations like hospitals have started to switch where they get their food from. So this is a procurement issue. And they've started buying food from local organic producers. It doesn't have to travel far. It hasn't got the nasty things in it. And the money is going directly to the local area. So this is a solution that's in between, I've got to do, the individualized one that we all have to do on our own, or we have to refreeze the poles. These are local practical solutions. And I find this really exciting. The other thing that particularly has excited me is there's a group called the Women's Budget Group, and they have looked at the role of care. And I think what happened through COVID is everybody immediately realized that those important jobs in a community are the care jobs, whether informal care or paid for care. And of course, they're the worst paid jobs, they're the least valued jobs. And they said, what would happen if we put care at the heart of our economy? Because they found that care jobs are green jobs. They are much less polluting. And if you put £1 into, let's say, construction, retrofitting buildings to insulate them, all very important, but those jobs are often gendered. But if you put that same pound or an additional pound into care, those jobs are almost 3 times less polluting, and that pound produces far more jobs. So they have invited us to imagine an economy which is based around people's care needs. And once you start down that path, everything changes. And of course, some people say, well, this is very unrealistic. Let's be real. And you say, well, sending flying robots to the sun is unrealistic. Thinking about people's care needs is the height of realism, because most of us will need care at some stage in our life. It's actually avoiding short-termism and quick technological fixes. And it's thinking about putting human needs first and how that impacts upon the planet. And I know I'm talking on a podcast for people who've already done half this work in their imagination and already are in touch with those things. So, I'm not going to, I could spend 2 hours giving you really exciting examples of initiatives that are happening, led by women, but not only by women, often by women and men, that are really trying to think about things in a very different way, and how that if you try and tackle gender inequality, often you can end up doing things to save the planet at the same time. There is a link between the two.
Amazing. God, I've got goosebumps, Anne. I hope those things are happening at pace because they sound fantastic. And as you say, they are exactly the sort of thing that I kind of think about on a daily basis. It resonates so much, especially with me because I grow food and I see that there's so many issues around that. So yeah, I'm going to put all of those links in the show notes and I hope people will go away and look into it and research it, because they sound just the sort of thing we need. And as I say, it can't come quickly enough. And when are you going to be Prime Minister?
Oh, God forbid. No, I was going to say it needs young women like you doing that. But, one of the things I'm very critical of in my book is this kind of fetishization of young women and, putting all the burden on the young. And, we know the mental health crises that young women are going through, particularly post-COVID, and the impact of social media on that. And I see this very much as an intergenerational movement. There is a role for everyone in this, and not just intergenerational, but actually intergender. We need to push women to the front just because they've been pushed so far behind. But really, it does need everyone. So, we're not all in the same boat, but we do all need to help produce the solution.
I'd like to offer huge thanks to Anne for taking the time to talk about her work, and also to Daryl Moore, who wrote Gardening in a Changing World, where I first discovered Anne's work. Thank you to you for listening as well. Dr Ian Bedford is seeing us out now with an appropriate piece on the queens of the bee world.
For most bumblebee species, the new queens that emerged the previous summer will have spent winter in deep hibernation. All the other members of their colony would have died, and so during spring, it'll be just these new queens that we see buzzing around our gardens, searching for nectar to replenish the energy that they'll have lost through not feeding for 6 months. After a couple of weeks, though, they'll be fit enough for the vital role that they'll play in ensuring the survival of their species. This begins with a quest to find a nesting site, somewhere protected from the elements and hidden from predators. Depending on species, this could be in a hole in the ground, within dry leaves under a hedge, or even in a bird box, or high up within the cavity of a tree. But wherever the queen chooses, they'll all begin following the same behavioural process. A process that's been undertaken by many millions of generations before them. The first stage of this requires the queen to collect pollen, which she mixes with wax from her body to create a mound within the nest that she'll lay a few eggs on. She'll also collect nectar that she stores in a wax pot that she builds next to the mound. Then, just like a bird, the queen will sit on her eggs, keeping them warm by vibrating her muscles to create heat, whilst feeding from the nectar pot to maintain her energy. After several days, the eggs hatch into little white grubs that begin eating the pollen mound. Then, as they grow bigger, the queen will maintain them on pollen she forages for from nearby flowers. The grubs then mature in a couple of weeks and create cocoons, within which they develop into the first batch of adult worker bumblebees, which are all infertile females. Their job is to now relieve the queen of her foraging work, enabling her to remain within the nest for the rest of her life, laying eggs whilst being fed and protected by the workers. As the season progresses, the colonies grow to their maximum size, yet rarely containing more than 400 to 500 adult workers. The queens, however, will soon be coming to the end of their lives, so to ensure the generations continue, they stimulate some of their eggs into becoming new queens, whilst others that had remained unfertilised develop into males. When these eventually hatch into adults, they disperse from the nest, leaving the maternal queen to die and the colony to end. Flying away to find mates, the males will also soon die, whilst the new queens will feed on late-season nectar, storing energy reserves that will help them survive through the winter hibernation and allow us the pleasure of watching them buzzing around our gardens again the following spring.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.